Mr. George Soros immediately pounced. He, of that $1.9 billion in debt, he bought about $415 million of it. Cash on the barrelhead. Paid 50 cents on the dollar. One of the tenets of the reorganization was that all the current shareholders would be wiped out. The new creditors would assume equity positions in the company. I know that sounds complicated, and it can be, but really what it means is that the bondholders, one of which is Mr. Soros, after he bought the $415 million worth of debt, became a shareholder. And Mr. Soros is now the largest single shareholder in Odyssey radio stations, including WWL AM in New Orleans, an institution. Now, in America, you can't just go do this. Why is that? Because those airwaves on which WWL and the other radio stations broadcast, they don't belong to the radio stations. They belong to you, and you, and you, and you. These airwaves, the spectrum, if you will, they're owned by the American people.
Tonight's story opens with a warning, a billionaire, and a radio station that means everything to the people of Louisiana. On the Senate floor, John Kennedy zeroes in on a deal he says moved far too fast and left too many questions unanswered. At the center of the storm is George Soros, a powerful investor, a historic New Orleans station, and an FCC vote that Kennedy says looked anything but ordinary. This is not just a fight about business, this is a fight about influence, public airwaves, and whether political power helped speed a deal through the system. Kennedy does not hold back as he lays out what happened, why it matters, and why he believes the American people deserve answers. From bankruptcy court to Washington regulators, every piece of this story builds toward one uncomfortable question: was this really handled the way it should have been? And by the end of this video, viewers will understand exactly why Kennedy called the whole thing weird.
Mr. President, last week, President Biden, I wish him well, gave his farewell address to America. He said a number of things, but one in particular got my attention. He warned America about, quote, his words, not mine, quote, a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of very few ultra-wealthy people. President Biden went on to say, and I quote again, today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead, end quote. Now, I don't know who President Biden was talking about, but I know one particular circumstance about which I'm going to speak that fits his warning. Again, I don't know if the circumstance I'm about to describe is what President Biden meant, but if the shoe fits, wear it, Cinderella. Let me cut to the chase. Mr. George Soros is an oligarch. He's one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's a friend of President Biden's. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, President Biden just gave him, I think, the highest civilian honor that a president can give to a civilian, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Mr. George Soros is buying WWL AM radio in New Orleans. Let me say that again. That may not mean much to you, Mr. President, but it means a lot to my people in Louisiana. Mr. George Soros is buying WWL AM radio in New Orleans. WWL AM radio is practically an institution in my state. It's been around since 1922. 1922. Over 100 years. It's a clear channel. It's what the communications experts call a clear channel Class A station. Its transmitter power output is about 50,000 watts. That's a lot, folks. That's the maximum for commercial AM stations in the United States. It's the lead station on the New Orleans Saints radio network. It's an important station. And Mr. George Soros is buying it. Now, what does that mean, and how did this happen? WWL is owned by a national company called Odyssey. A-U-D-A-C-Y, Odyssey. Odyssey has about 220 radio stations nationwide, one of which, of course, is WWL. Second largest radio network in America. It reaches, I think, 45 different markets throughout our country, Mr. President. 165 million Americans. It's huge. Odyssey borrowed too much money. They took on too much debt. They took on about $1.9 billion worth of debt, and they couldn't service that debt with their revenues. So what did they do? They did what many other corporations do when they can't service their debt. They went into what's called Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Not Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is when they liquidate the company. Chapter 11 bankruptcy is when a company goes into bankruptcy in front of a bankruptcy judge and says, Judge, we want to get all of our creditors and debtors together and restructure our cash flow and our debt so we can come out of this bankruptcy a surviving entity. They went into Chapter 11 with a bankruptcy plan. Mr. George Soros immediately pounced. He, of that $1.9 billion in debt, he bought about $415 million of it. Cash on the barrelhead. Paid 50 cents on the dollar. One of the tenets of the reorganization was that all the current shareholders would be wiped out. The new creditors would assume equity positions in the company. I know that sounds complicated, and it can be, but really what it means is that the bondholders, one of which is Mr. Soros after he bought the $415 million worth of debt, became a shareholder. And Mr. Soros is now the largest single shareholder in Odyssey radio stations, including WWL AM in New Orleans, an institution. Now, in America, you can't just go do this. Why is that? Because those airwaves on which WWL and the other radio stations broadcast, they don't belong to the radio stations. They belong to you, and you, and you, and you. These airwaves, the spectrum, if you will, they're owned by the American people. And years ago, we created the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. We set it up to be in charge of the airwaves that belong to the American people, to make sure that those airways were being used prudently by radio stations. For example, if a radio station is bought by a bunch of foreign nationals or foreign entities, the FCC has got to approve it. For example, anytime a broadcast license, as is the case with Odyssey, is transferred, the FCC has to approve it. So Mr. Soros' purchase of WWL radio and the 219 other radio stations had to go before the FCC. And it did. And it went, the approval for Mr. Soros went through the FCC like green grass through a goose. And it was a party line vote. It was last September. All three Democrats, there are 5 people on the FCC, all 3 Democrats said, let it go. And they short-circuited the normal process. Now, I'm not an FCC expert, and I'm not a communications law expert, but I've read, this has been widely reported, and I've read about it in many reports. Normally, on a deal of this size, when 220 radio stations are being transferred, their licenses, using airways that belong to the American people, and there's a substantial percentage of foreign owners, it would take about a year to get through the FCC. FCC would do a complete investigation. Not this time, no. This time was special. What happened was what some members of the media have called the Soros shortcut.
Kennedy closed with the kind of clarity that has made him one of the most effective voices in Washington, calm enough to stay focused, sharp enough to make every point land. He did not shout to get attention. He used facts, timing, and plain language to make the entire situation sound as troubling as it appeared. What made his argument powerful was that he was not attacking free speech. He was defending transparency and the public's right to know who's gaining influence over trusted airwaves. He made it clear that when powerful billionaires move quietly through a process that looks rushed, Americans have every reason to ask questions and demand answers. Kennedy stood up for the people of Louisiana by reminding them that stations like WWL are not just business assets, they are part of the public conversation and should be treated with that level of seriousness. He also exposed how dangerous it can be when political connections and regulatory speed seem to move side by side, especially in matters involving media power. His message was simple but strong. The law should be followed carefully. The public should be respected fully, and no one should get special treatment behind closed doors. In a moment where many leaders avoid uncomfortable truths, Kennedy leaned into the controversy and said exactly what millions of Americans were already thinking. That is why his speech did more than criticize a strange deal. It reminded the country that real leadership means speaking plainly, defending fairness, and refusing to stay silent when something looks wrong.